Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and to another colouring page. So this is Frog Girl. It is in Colouring Heaven's Bad Girl Halloween issue and it is by Rosrysowanamama. I do apologise. I will write the name out properly. I am not 100% sure how to pronounce this name, but look how cute the illustration is. I just knew I needed to colour this one as soon as I saw it. So I thought I would give a little explanation on how I use alcohol markers as a base. I've had this question pop up a couple of times, so I figured this was a really good illustration to sort of highlight that. So you can see I have pulled out a bunch of alcohol markers and I've primarily pulled out my Copics because when it comes to working with alcohol markers as a base, there is two ways I work. I work either with a brush nib or I work with a bullet nib. There's also the chisel nib, which I use similar to a bullet nib, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So I'm starting with the skin, and I generally do start with the skin, and I'm starting with a brush marker. And I do apologise that my camera keeps going in and out of focus. I had to reset some stuff and I did not realise it reset the focus of my camera. So initially there will be a little bit of going in and out of focus as I change alcohol markers. But I start off with the skin and I start off by working with the brush markers and working in a flicking motion. So I start by thinking where the shadows would be on the face, for example under the nose, and it's going to be darkest around the nostril of the nose. So I will start by putting my brush pen there and then flicking down to create the shadow, and as you flick down and lighten your pressure, the marker produces a softer, lighter edge, so you end up with more pigment at the start and less at the end, and it creates a little bit of a gradient. So I use this to sort of feather out the edges of my marker, and this is why I like using brush markers, especially for skin, because it's so much easier to blend out. And with something like skin, where you might want to use several tones to create shadows and highlights, having that ability to feather works really well. The other thing I do is I work quite a few colours at once. So you'll see in this I'm currently using EO2 Fruit Pink and E50 Eggshell, and switching between the two colours and trying to work relatively fast as I blend out this marker. The ink in alcohol markers dries relatively fast, so if you are trying to blend a couple of tones together, you do need to work them quickly. And that is why I'm also only working one section of skin at a time. For example, right now I'm only working on the face. I have not started on the neck and I have not started on the arm. But the great thing about alcohol markers also drying in layers and drying relatively quickly is you can layer up tones and rework into them. Alcohol markers will also reactivate with the addition of more alcohol marker. So if you decide you do need to go back and darken an area, you can keep working over it. However, you need to keep blending it out and smoothing it out. So when you're starting to put these tones down, it's always worthwhile to know where your light source is and where your shadows are going to be. So in this illustration, under the neck has got a little shadow section, and of course the shadow of the neck will create quite an extreme highlight shadow there, but the highlights of the nose, the contours of the face, none of these are actually illustrated for us. So you have to think about the shape of what you're colouring and where you want a darker tone and where you want a lighter tone. And if you're in doubt, work light, because you can always darken, but it's very hard to lighten alcohol markers. So I tend to work the dark area first, flick it out, and then work in a lighter tone and keep building up like that. I also work a lot of layers into one section. I'm not just going over an area once, I am working quite a few layers at once. Now you'll see as we get into the arm section that I struggle with the fact that my alcohol markers are very low in ink. I am desperately needing to refill most of my Copic markers. So as we start to work the bigger sections, there is a lot more streakiness, and I have to do a lot more layers to try and blend these tones together. And that is the other thing as well, is a drier marker is harder to blend out. So having a nice field of ink marker will make it a lot easier. When a marker is drying out, it becomes a lot harder to blend evenly and smoothly. And in a section like this forearm, where you've got a big flat section, it's always handy to try and work this section quickly and all at once in order to create a smooth tone. If you stop and start, you're going to end up with a clear edge where the alcohol marker has dried and then you've worked back over it. So I do try to get as much of this tone down as quickly as possible and working back over the edges a multitude of times to create a nice, smooth, even color surface. You can really see how my marker is dried out here and how it is struggling to lay down some tone. And I end up using the Eggshell to try and push that alcohol marker as much as possible. So the other thing to be considerate of is that with alcohol markers, they do have a tendency to bleed, and they can bleed beyond the edge of a page. Yeah, so I'm here trying to just get any ink out of these markers by using the chisel nib. And with big sections as well, the chisel nib's quite handy, which we'll talk about when we get to the dress. But yeah, it's struggling. So yes, with markers, because of the alcohol in them, they do tend to spread a little bit and they can bleed all over the page. So another thing to be conscious of is working directly up to the line. It can cause the colour to seep beyond the line, which isn't illustrated so much in this section, but with these drier markers, but you will see that coming up. So because I needed to work another layer over the chin, I needed to work over other sections of the skin to blend that in. So now I've grabbed my pale cherry pink, and I'm just using this to, initially this was going to be the blush colour, but when I laid it down, I tested this separately, and then when I laid it down on top of the other colours, I realised it actually works as a bit of a shadow colour. It's not as pink as I intended for the blush, which is great because it gave me another colour to use on top of that fruit pink to help blend it out. So now you'll see me start to rework back into those areas and using that same flicking motion to try and blend out the colour that I am adding on top to make that blend smooth. I should have ideally worked this when I was working each section so that it would blend out nice and smooth, and not have like a hard edge. So at least with like flicking it, I can try to reduce the amount of hard edge and create a softer blend. And this is particularly useful here where I was struggling to get that flat colour down with my dyeing fruit pink. This pale cherry pink is really good for helping to fill in a bit more and just blend out. And again, because it is an alcohol marker going on top of existing alcohol marker, it does activate and pick up that pigment a little bit, so I am able to smush around the existing pigment a little bit, but not immensely, but it at least covers up. You might be seeing as I work on this as well, there is sort of like a green tint or some lines coming through under the drawing. That's because as the alcohol is put on the page, it goes a little bit more translucent. So it is actually just the piece of protective paper I have underneath. As the page dries, this will disappear. So now I have the R22 Light Prawn, and this had been pulled out as a lip colour, but I decided to also use it as the blush colour. Now this has got quite a significant difference to the colours that I was using previously, so while I am still trying to blend it out and feather it out, it's too extreme of a change to truly blend out properly. So I'm having to work back over with that pale cherry pink to help blend out those tones and make it mush together a little bit more, just to create that smooth gradient. But the process is still the same, working that nib, starting where I want it darkest and then fanning it out. And then I will pull out the cherry pink and use that to sort of blend out those edges by smushing down more ink and alcohol. You can use a blender marker for this, however, because there's no pigment in there, I find it tends to push all the pigment around and you can end up with white splotchy areas. The blender marker is only good if you want to sort of pastelize out to nothing the edge of the alcohol marker. In fact, I use my blender marker more for actually activating water soluble pencils than I do for blending alcohol markers. So yeah, while the page is still wet, just trying to get that final little gradient blend to smooth out that prawn colour that I put on, but I'm happy with it. So now I'm just deciding what section to do next, and because the skin is so wet, it's better to start the next colour away from where that wet skin is. So originally I was going to start on maybe the hair, but of course the hair is right next to the cheeks, and if I put an alcohol marker next to the currently wet alcohol marker, it's going to start absorbing that colour, so I need to give that area some time to dry. So this little frog is far away from those absolutely saturated cheeks, so I was like, okay, I can start with the frog. So this is the other way that I will often work, is I might only have a couple of colours. So with the skin we're blending a lot of colours and trying to keep some very light lights and some very dark tones. With the frog I just have two colours. I have GO2, which is spectrum green, and then I have BG13, which is mint green. And so I start by laying down a base colour of the GO2, and then I'll start working the mint green into where the shadows are and just fanning that back up, just like we had before. But this time the whole section is covered. It's not just a portion of it with leaving some white or extreme light areas. We've got a whole base tone down this time. And then after I have this base tone and then the next layer of the mint, I will work that base tone color back in and use that as our blender, because you can also layer the same color a couple of times, because as each layer dries you're building up tone in that area. So if you have a very limited shade of markers and you need to create some more blends by using the same tone repeatedly, you can build up a few layers and keep building up that pigment. So you can see the difference here between layer 1 and layer 2 of the alcohol marker. And then because I want to redarken some of those areas even more, I pull out that dark mint green again and just work over that section again, much smaller than last time, just to add a little bit more tonal variation. I'm not going for like perfect blend as is, because I know I'm going to work a little bit of pencil into here, because the amount of shadow I want to get, it gets too fine. It's hard to work fine details in the markers. So now you saw me tap the face to feel how dry it was, and I could feel that the markers have absorbed and the paper was dry, so it was time to add in another layer. So this is where a dry marker can be used to your advantage. This is E71 Champagne, and it's a beautiful brown tone, but it is so dry and again in desperate need of a refill. But because of that, when I layer it down, it's a very light dusting of colour, so it works really well to put a subtle shadow over skin tone. And then in certain areas where maybe I'd built it up too strong or it had been a bit patchy, I just pull back out the pale fruit pink, and the pale cherry pink, and I use that as our blender to wherever it might be a little too patchy, because this marker is running on a little bit of pigment but hardly any alcohol. So by using another marker to activate that little bit of pigment that's being dropped, I can kind of smush it around and make it just a little bit smoother. So it doesn't add much, but it is adding just a little bit more definition and contrast, because my goal with the skin is to not do any pencil work on it. The rest of it I'll come back in and add some pencils on. So what am I thinking here? So this is where I start on the hat and the dress. So I know I want the hat to be sort of a charcoaly grey, but I often do black and dark grey in a lighter grey tone, and then use my pencil to darken shadows to give the illusion that it's a darker toned fabric. Because by working lighter, you can always darken, but it's very hard to lighten. So I'm sort of working my lighter tone of what I want the fabric to be, with the intention of coming back and adding shadows. Now I don't actually have a lot of dark greys, which is why I'm using another technique here, where I simply use one marker and lay down a flat colour. And this is where I will use chisel nibs or bullet tip nibs, because it does not matter if I don't have a brush marker for this, because I'm just laying down a solid flat colour that I will work the shadows in with pencil. So for this one, I've actually pulled out my Letraset Promarker in Ice Grey. And you can see that I'm using a mixture of the chisel nib and the bullet nib, depending on the area I'm working on, primarily the chisel nib, because by working with a bigger marker face, I can lay down that nice flat tone. And this is especially important in a colour like this, where I want to lay down just one colour. I'm not working in shadows or tones. So I want to create as smooth of a marker base as possible, so working as quick as possible to fill that area produces a smoother tone. So in the big flat areas, I do use the chisel. Now one of the problems I was having is behind this page I have just a cut up wall calendar. It's a really good marker protector between pages so that your markers don't bleed through. Because when you're working in alcohol markers, you always need to protect the pages behind your colouring page, because alcohol markers will bleed through. Unfortunately, this marker is one of the juiciest markers in my collection. Like, it is a juicy. And so much so that the alcohol and ink is actually pooling on the other side into little pools, and it can't be absorbed quick enough by this calendar. This calendar will absorb a little bit, but it's so juicy it's pooling up. And then you'll see in certain sections it just sucked back through. So beside her left ear and at the top of the left hand side on the hat, these little bubbles where the ink is sort of blowing through. Now I'm not too worried about it on her hair because I'm planning on doing her hair grey, so I know I can work through that. On the hat itself, what I've got planned for the background, I can kind of work it in. But this is one of the risks of alcohol markers, is that because they are an absorbent medium, they will spread, and you do have to be aware of how they may spread and affect the page. So, you know, when you work with these media, try to have something a little bit more absorbent, particularly if your markers are juicy. Again, I've been working with some pretty dry markers lately, so I had entirely forgotten how juicy this marker was. And that was my bad. So at some point I do end up grabbing just like an old piece of newsprint, and I put that on top of the calendar, which helps absorb some of the extra ink as it spreads around. Yeah, so I get a little bit there on the left, and that's when I'm like, oh, and put a piece of absorbent newsprint behind, and that just helps pick up a lot of the extra ink, which stops it spreading around so much. So in this dress section, you can see what I mean about trying to work solidly and quickly in order to create a smooth blend. This is a large area to cover, and if I was working with the bullet nib, for example, it would be very hard to get a good flat even tone. So by working with the chisel nib and working over the layers a couple of times, so I work the section over a few times, that is also going to help create a flat tone. And you will see that I don't worry about avoiding the chain or the pearls, because those sort of details, the alcohol marker, even if I try to colour pedantically around it, the alcohol marker is going to bleed and cover it regardless. So that sort of detail I tend to just colour over, and then I will pull it back out with gel pens, lighter pencils, or stickles, or liquid pearls, which is what I did here. Is I used liquid pearls to help pull those details back out. Another thing for clothes, if you are working a big section like this, is you can try to work within the folds of the clothes, because as you work back over a section, if it is not blended out flat and smooth, you get very clear lines. You can see it there as I change nib end. You can see where the second layer has very clearly been put on and not covered the whole thing evenly. And that's what I mean about using the same marker as a blender. You can work that. So in the time it's taken me to do the dress, the hat has dried, so now we can work the leaves. And the leaves, I'm just doing the same thing that I've done for the hat and the dress. I am just laying down a base tone of green, and that is because the leaves, the detail on them and the shading on them is very, very tiny. It's a lot of veins and a lot of center line work, and getting any sort of specific tiny line detail in alcohol markers is very difficult to achieve. I have seen people who have done it. I am not skilled enough to do it, so I find it easier in this situation to just put down a base tone and then know that I can work over it later in pencils to pick up the spine of the leaves and veins of the leaves and create shading that way. But by putting down the base tone in the alcohol marker first, it helps cover the tooth of the page, and that will actually make it much quicker, because I don't need to colour in the whole leaf. I can just colour in the shading and call it a day. It actually takes me a little longer to colour in something in a flat colour when I'm using the brush marker. I find if I'm trying to produce a flat tone for a base, the bullet tip is so much easier than the brush nib I am currently using, because the brush nib is so soft and flexible, which is great for blending, but for putting down a flat color I find it very uneven. So now I'm just sort of deciding what other areas I want to colour in this tone, because it's easier to use similar tones in a page to help bring a page together, particularly a page like this where I'm keeping the colours quite limited. So I chose to also put the green in her eyes. So first I pulled up what I thought I had picked out one of my cool greys, but I had actually pulled out a different colour, which came useful later. But now what I am doing is I'm doing the hair. So I'm currently using Cool Grey number 3. And with hair I cannot shade the way that I'd like to shade it. As I said before, getting specific line, fine shading details is very difficult. And with how I like to shade here, I cannot get that textural detail, I cannot get the line work, I cannot get what I would like to achieve in here. So what I focus on with alcohol markers is the actual shading. So I will put in tones to represent the shadows or the highlights. So in this piece I want her to have very light grey pale hair. So I'm using Cool Grey 3 and just blending it out like I did before in the other areas of the skin, but this time I'm not focusing on creating a smooth transition. It's okay if there's a little bit of line or rougher edges, because that represents sort of the textural nature of the hair. Hair is textured while skin is smooth. I mean, yes, you could argue skin has texture and hair can be flat, but you know, like hair, when you think of it, has a texture, whereas skin we tend to portray as smooth. So you'll see I'm working quite streaky on the hair and working sort of in lines following the shape of the hair. But now I'm going to use the same colour to sort of do the white collar of her dress. And in here I'm working a different way to the hair. So the hair was worked in streaks, and now I'm putting in the colour where the shadows would be, but in a more blotchy, spread out manner. The idea to create sort of like texture and pull and wrinkles on the clothes. So skin tend to do smooth gradient blends, hair streaky line work, and then in this collar, because I want a little bit of texture, I will work sort of a dotty almost, or blotchy, with the intent of blending it out, as I am doing here with a Cool Grey 0, C0. And I just find this produces sort of like a stiffer look of fabric, like a collar would be. And then I use this same Cool Grey just to add some more definition to the hair and some more shadow areas, because there is a little bit of pigment in this color, not a lot, but you know, just working on those shadows, just picking up some areas, and again working those same sort of streaky lines, focusing on where the shadows would be. So now I have my Blue Violet 31, which is Pale Lavender, and I actually thought this color had run out of juice, but it turns out I had a second one and this one was brand new, and I was like, hallelujah, because as you would have heard, we used a lot of pink tones in the skin, and the skin is looking very peachy and warm, especially compared to the coolness of her body. And one of my favorite tricks to do with skin is to use a pale lavender purple as a shadow color, because shadows tend to be cooler, whereas the things that project towards us tend to be warmer. So cooler colors tend to recess, while warmer colors tend to come forward. So by using this pale lavender, I'm again just defining some of those shadows that I have created and just really making them recede. And this final touch means that I will not need to go in with my pencils on the skin at all. The skin will be blended enough with just the alcohol markers, which will save me a little bit of work, but also it's nice to show the different contrasts so you can see how you can just use alcohol markers as is. You don't have to pull in pencils. I like to pull in pencils when I use the Copic markers as well, or the alcohol markers, because again, that refinement of detail is very difficult when with alcohol markers. So by using the combination, you can achieve a really good look. And so far this is about half an hour of work, and like you could almost just walk away and call this done as is, and I know a lot of people would. Or, you know, just finish basing out some of the colours and walk away and call this done. And that's totally valid too. I choose to work it a little bit more, and you will see me do that. So the only other thing that I do is I pull out my E00, which is cotton pearl, and I use that to base a couple of areas, such as the skull on her dress, that skull badge, just to put that warm yellowish tone under the piece, under the badge. I know I'm going to cover this in stickles, so I'm not too worried here. And I use it to base some other areas that I know I'm going to cover in stickles, just so that if for some reason a little area of stickles doesn't cover it, even though it's a very pigmented glitter glue, it's just got a little bit of colour underneath. So yeah, I just chuck this down as a base tone in a few areas, and then I also decide to do the frog's eyes with it as well, just to keep that colour flowing through. But yeah, that is the entirety of this page based. I am now going to put you into time lapse as I finish off the page to show you how I finish it. So I use a mixture of POLYCHROMOS pencils, Distress inks, POSCAs, stickles, and liquid pearls. And I will list all the specific colours down below for you so you can have a look and see what I specifically use. But I hope you enjoy this video. I hope you find it useful. If my explanations aren't very clear, because I am aware like this is very intuitive to me, it's something I've done for a while, and trying to explain it to someone who hasn't done it, it might not be clearly portrayed. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will do my best to help you with them. This will work for any type of alcohol markers. I just pulled out the Copics and the Letraset one that I had, but any brush marker, any alcohol marker, any of those will work for this sort of effect. But yeah, let me know if you found this useful, and thank you for watching, and I'll put on the music now. See you in the next video.